now we'll move to another extraordinary story, to the story of Abbas Nazari, whose book is on sale, I believe, down there. Now, this is a wonderful story. In a sense, it's also a very troubling story because, as the writer himself reflects, he is telling the story of so many refugees. His is a success story, and it is well worth the read. Abbas is a product of the Tampa, but this book is called After the Tampa, and I believe that's important because what we've seen in Ballarat is 2 decades of how a community can react after the Tampa. And in Abbas's case, we have a man who's lived his life after the Tampa. I'd like you to make Abbas welcome. I'd like you to thank him for joining us because this is an extraordinary story to tell. And I think perhaps most of all, he writes in a simple but very profound manner that reflects just that. Welcome, Abbas.
Hello, everybody. Can I just have a nod of someone's head to say that you can hear me loud and clear?
We certainly can. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. I'm speaking to everybody from the beautiful hometown of Christchurch, New Zealand, here in the South Island. You know, I get a lot of speaking gigs to come here and there, but when I got the call to come speak to the folks in Ballarat, firstly I had to Google where it was. But secondly, you know, once I dug into some of the work that the Courier and most importantly, some of the work that folks in Ballarat did in welcoming refugees, particularly after the Tampa and in the years since, of course, I thought, why not? What better stage, what better community of people to speak to? As you mentioned, I have just written this book after the Tampa. I'm gutted I couldn't come over, obviously, with travel restrictions in place. But, you know, there are books there for sale, and I am looking to come over there that way in March and April next year. So hopefully I'll get to meet you guys in person. Look, this book, the response to it has been incredible. You know, the silver lining, you know, if you were going to write a book about Afghanistan, you couldn't have timed it better than me. It came out the same week that Kabul fell. But I think what it showed is that there's a genuine interest in why that country is in the way that it's in. And most importantly, as the title suggests, it's about what happens afterwards. What happens to the lucky few who are resettled in foreign countries such as Australia and New Zealand? What kind of lives do they lead? You know, how do they view the world and all the rest of it? And so that is something that I try to get across.
Abbas, can we just go back a little bit there? Because I think it is very much the thought on everybody's mind. This is it's a book that begins with trauma and it begins with separation and a lot of extraordinary relation of what happened to you. And then I think it ends with a lot of hope, not only your own achievements, whether it's the spelling bee or your trip to Georgetown, but how do you feel now that Kabul has fallen and that the threats that drove your family away from there more than 20 years ago are in fact threatening the population, those threats to women's education, those threats to civil liberty, the brutality. How does that make you feel now?
In the immediate days after Kabul fell to the Taliban, my immediate thoughts and energies were going towards helping the family and friends that I had that were stuck over there. These were Afghan New Zealanders, Afghan Australians who had gone over to arrange a funeral for an elderly parent who had passed due to coronavirus, because keep in mind that's a thing. Folks who had gone over and got stuck because of the border restrictions, all the rest of it. So my thought was on helping them get out. And then, so I didn't actually have any time to kind of reflect on how that country managed to crumble again in the spectacular way that it did. So it's only been in the recent weeks and months that I've kind of had a chance to take it all in. And look, it's absolutely tragic. That's the defining word. It's been the defining word of that country for the past 50 odd years. We left Afghanistan in early 2001, 20 years ago. The very month, you know, we arrived in New Zealand in September 2001. So almost 20 years to the very month that we arrived to New Zealand, Afghanistan falls to the Taliban. It's opened up another brutal chapter in that country's history. My only hope is that those folks still stuck in Afghanistan, those folks who are perhaps at more risk than the general public, those are, ethnic minorities, those are human rights workers, people who have helped with the international effort. I hope that they are given a chance to safety. And that's what we're lobbying for today.
It would seem to me that, as was mentioned by the panel earlier today, that 3,000 is far too small a number for Australia to accept. But perhaps more of that later. I think your story is fascinating, not only from the events of what took place in 2001, which have been told many times, but perhaps not as up close as that. I was particularly disturbed by that incident where a bucket of jam is placed on the deck of the Tampa, and the SAS soldiers are filming it, almost as if they're taunting the particular individuals. I think that reflects very poorly on, obviously, those particular individuals, but the desperate and inhuman nature of what people are driven to in those circumstances. And yet out of that, you seem to draw, even that you draw some hope of people who are continually looking for a better life. Is that what you found in New Zealand?
It's exactly what we found in New Zealand. If I were to give you the 60-second version of the central tenets of this book, the message that I'm trying to get folks to understand is this, that some folks, depending on where they are born, have it better than others. It's one of complete luck. And so, but you actually just need three things to really thrive in life, and that is personal security, that is dignity, and that is agency. Being an ethnic and a religious minority in a country that's always known war for so many decades, we didn't have any of that. We didn't have personal security, we didn't have dignity, and we didn't have agency to change our lives. And so, when we were finally resettled to New Zealand, we were given those three things. We were safe, we were secure, we had dignity, and we had agency. And once we were granted those things, then the world was our oyster. My favorite part about writing this book is what happens once people are resettled. You know, that notion that your entire life is in your hands, in the palm of your hands, and you can actually change your outcome. The fact that you can just go out, and my favorite chapter in this entire book is called The Kiwi Dream. You know, talking about the hardships along the way, but most importantly, what happens when you give these guys, anyone, any family, any individual lucky enough to call Aotearoa New Zealand home, what happens? And that is the story of After the Tampa. So relating it back to the current situation in Afghanistan and the response or lack of in Australia, it is, look, these folks just need a bit of security and some dignity and some agency, because the life and the society around them has collapsed, and collapsed in the most spectacular way. And so 3,000 is almost insulting. And there are so many other ways. If you don't want to increase the number of folks that you're bringing in, and I'm sure we'll have a discussion after this, then how about those who are on temporary protection visas, TPVs? You know, why not open to 20,000? I know that previous governments have done the same for other countries. You know, there's been a concerted campaign online for an increase in an emergency intake of Afghan refugees, but it seems to be falling on deaf ears. And that's absolutely tragic, especially given what's happening in Afghanistan right now.
In New Zealand, you talk about the Kiwi dream, and there's some wonderful anecdotes you relate in there about first seeing children bouncing on a trampoline next door and thinking, how are those children flying? You know, as a little kid, you were experiencing things you'd never seen in Afghanistan. And did the community over there embrace you? And the reason I ask that is one of the most powerful instruments against refugees is to dehumanize them. And you highlight that only a single photo of the Tampa was used. And that was a political expedient as well, in not being the public were not able to relate to the suffering of what was going on that boat. So you come to New Zealand, you begin to build a new life. How did the people react, and did they hear your story and embrace you?
Going to the first part of your question about that othering, that dehumanization that takes place. You know, during the Tampa affair, we might as well have been on another planet. We were a boatload of nameless and faceless foreigners held out there in the Indian Ocean with no pictures, no stories, no personal connection, no names, nothing. And that is purposely done so that these folks just remain a statistic. You know, at the very most, they are just a statistic. And so there is no human connection. You know, fast forward a few weeks later when we arrived to New Zealand and we're welcomed and we're given the highest form of welcome in Indigenous culture here in New Zealand, which is a porphyry, you know, formal welcome to these lands, welcome to New Zealand, this is home for you. The most amount of food I've ever seen in my life, you know, song and dance, and the entire community embraced us. And then we were resettled throughout New Zealand in cities and towns that had state housing available. You know, and I was resettled to here in Christchurch, New Zealand, which has been home ever since. And the community has just embraced us. You know, folks who, you know, keep in mind, you know, it's a working class community that is, you know, culturally diverse. You know, we had Pacific Island community, we had, you know, Pākehā European community, and then we have Indigenous populations as well, and all kind of went to school together, got jobs together and the rest of it. Had we been resettled elsewhere within New Zealand that wasn't as welcoming, had we, you know, been left out on our own without any support, I don't think I'd have such fond memories of growing up in New Zealand, but that wasn't the case. And I know for the very few who are given, luckily granted resettlement in Australia, you know, they have some pretty fond experiences, but they're the minority because of the many, many thousands of others who are sadly turned away.
We do have some success stories here in Victoria. Out in Nil, there's a great example of a Karen refugee community who were resettled there with a specific employment objective at the Ballarat processing facility out there. And interestingly, they were met with a degree of resistance, possibly based around the strangeness of it, but it has rebuilt what was a largely declining and ageing rural population. And that's always a challenge for communities to embrace something that's new. But just, you were young when you moved to New Zealand, and so it's become, I suppose, your life. What about your parents? You mentioned that like any older refugee group, they were always going to have a foot in the old country and a foot in the new. They learnt their English, they didn't learn their English as quickly as you, and there was those moments where they felt quite displaced and dispossessed before employment changed that. Is that a major barrier for when refugees first arrive in a country and why they tend to kind of congregate together and sometimes get bad names for themselves?
It's a really, really good question, and there's a number of parts there which I'll unpack. Firstly, you're right. You know, when you're older and you come to a foreign country, especially a foreign country such as New Zealand, compared to the place that you grew up from, it's incredibly hard to rewire your brain, to rethink and learn and adapt and pick up the new dynamics of the society that is now home for you. And so, of course, my parents found it hard. Picking up a language was hard, all the rest of it. And so they were on a much slower pace than us kids. But to your second point about resettlement and finding strength or weakness in community, I find that where migrants coalesce in a particular area or a particular side of town or in particular neighbourhoods, they do it out of necessity in the beginning because of how hard it is for parents especially to feel welcome, to feel connected, to feel that sense of community which they had back home, back where, you know, their native homelands. But that can also metastasize into something that's perhaps, you know, leads to pretty bad social outcomes. You know, I don't want neighbourhoods of Melbourne or Sydney or elsewhere to think, oh, that's the Afghan neighbourhood, or that's where all the Afghans live, or that's where all so-and-so live. You know, it's nice in the beginning, but it shouldn't be one that you stay at and think this is it for me. It should be one of upward mobility. And having those conversations here in Christchurch or here in New Zealand, it's doable because the community is so small, but having the same conversations with Afghans in Australia, because the populations are a bit larger, you do get some pushback on that. And so it is not, you know, negative. It's not, you know, has poor intentions. It just comes out of necessity. If refugees or migrants are resettled in outside the major centres, and I know you gave an example there, and there are many, many towns in rural Australia crying for refugees. I think that in itself would be a huge, huge success story.
Yeah. Of course, in Christchurch, Abbas, you've undergone or experienced another terrible trauma. The March 15 massacres obviously shocked the world, and I think the way that that particularly hideous event was disseminated online has all sorts of lessons, which I think technology is still really grasping to catch up to. But as a person who would have been deeply, deeply affected by it in your community, how do you react to what is effectively an extremist minority that grabs the limelight with such force? And how do you go on living in hope? Because, you know, I don't speak for all of Ballarat, but I could say that an overwhelming majority, you know, 99.99% would abhor that kind of activity without even hesitation. And that goes for most of the nastiness which we're seeing, unfortunately, on the rise in Australia, and extremism that's based on fear and hate and a lot of regurgitated ideologies. But given that is not the spirit of the community, given that is not how people feel, how do you react, and what would your advice be to how to respond to what seems to be an emerging reactive movement?
That's a solid question there, and allow me a couple of minutes to answer that. Firstly, you know, one of the hardest chapters to write in the book was, you know, what I call a dark day in the Garden City. You know, I was just right there down the road when the attacks were taking place. And so, you know, it struck me personally. I knew a few of the victims who were gunned down that day. To get to the crux of your question, and it is this. You have extremists in every faith, in every ethnicity, in every group, be they Islamic, be they ethno-nationalist, be they white supremacist, be they whatever. There will be extremists in every ethnic group, every faith group. And so our mission, I guess, as a society is, who do we listen to? Do we listen to that incredibly vocal and incredibly attention-seeking minority? Or do we kind of put our ear to the ground and listen to the voice of the vast majority of folks who are going about their day-to-day? March 15th happened, and I mean, the silver lining to it, if I can call it that, was that it allowed Kiwis and Australians and many others around the world to see that terrorism comes in all shapes and sizes and colours. And it was so incredibly profound to hear the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern call it exactly that, calling it a terrorist attack where so many other leaders have fumbled in the past. And so that way, that labelling then allows it to say, this is it. This is no difference from an ISIS member going and blowing up a mosque or, you know, anything else. They're all one and you know, parcel. And so, how do you counter that? You know, I studied a Master's in Securities at Georgetown University on a Fulbright scholarship. I studied this for 2 years. And the thing is, this threat is growing and will likely never go away. It will grow and turn into something different. You know, I witnessed a number of these extremist attacks in Washington, in the US, while I was there. And so, as a society, you have to answer, what is it that is causing mostly these young males disillusioned, both being radicalized to become Islamic extremists or being radicalized into becoming white or ethno-nationalist supremacists? And so that is an incredibly, incredibly tough policy question for our intelligence agencies. The review into the March 15th attacks, the Royal Commission of Inquiry, has made a number of different recommendations that will probably take about 3 to 5 years for the New Zealand government to respond to. But one of the core recommendations was that it is a societal approach. Radicalization, which takes every form, again, like I said, across ethnic, skin, whatever, you know, demographic you want to call it. And so there's a societal approach to challenge it. And that's going to be a long, long story.
That does sound like an enormous and a very, very serious task for the future. We've finished today talking about the future. One thing I can say that is a positive is that part of solving some of those societal problems around estrangement, isolation and radicalisation. I think one of the things must be a society that is willing to welcome and willing to embrace. And one thing I can say for the room here today, Abbas, is this is a community within a community that's taken an enormously welcoming and human approach to the whole refugee issue. They don't necessarily have the policy solutions themselves. They certainly probably don't have the logistical solutions that are so important to Canberra bureaucrats. What they have is the hand they hold out of welcome. And I think Ballarat is a slightly larger city. It's not a country town anymore, but it's still, that hand of welcome, that embrace of welcome still exists. So that's a real positive. And our speakers tonight on the panel have probably faced, like you, a degree of trauma, a degree of frustration and hopelessness at times. But I'd like to take you back to the metaphor you use and that you used from the village of the small drop of water falling on a stone. And the obdurate stone, which some of our panel believed comes by the name of border force in this country, can, and some might even say various ministers, but can be worn away by a slow and constant drop of humanity. So I guess to finish then, from my point of view, what advice would you give to these groups, to their seemingly tireless energy to hold out that hand of welcome and to make a difference?
Firstly, an enormous amount of gratitude. In New Zealand, we were welcomed by volunteers, community members who would give up an hour or two of their time a week to take us to sports clubs, to take us to footy, to take us to supermarkets and help us navigate our new life. And in that moment, we never even had the chance to say thank you. And so I dedicate this book to those people who welcomed us, who gave up their time, who said, this is home for you as well. And so I want to begin with that. It is sometimes thankless work. It is sometimes incredibly challenging, and that comes in all forms, emotional, language, technical, cultural, all the rest of it. But it is bloody worth it, because 20 years on, to look at where we came from and look at where we are today and all of the incredible challenges and opportunities that came our way, I just feel so incredibly blessed. And I know that any family who's currently seeking a new life out of Afghanistan, who's lucky enough to be resettled throughout Ballarat or any of the other beautiful towns across Australia, they too will feel that same sense of gratitude. And so I think keep pushing, and I don't know how responsive your local member of parliament is, but keep blasting those emails and phone calls, and know that, as incredibly tiresome, as incredibly disheartening as it might be sometimes when you're not hearing anything back or when you feel like the government's moved on, know that the ultimate challenge is worth it, to welcome these folks from foreign countries, then in time for them to call themselves proud Aussies or proud Kiwis. It's worth it.
Thank you. Sage advice, Abbas. Now, I think we'll move to some questions. I'm sure there's lots more questions that people would like to ask, if you're happy to take a few questions. David.
I was actually going to pass the microphone to someone, but since you've invited...
Can you hear that, Abbas? Can you hear that okay?
If you could repeat the question, I'll hear you.
Okay.
No, not the question in the crowd, but you hear it and then you talk back to me.
Okay, I will, yeah.
Okay, the question that interests me is the colonial history. I would like something said about the Durand Line, what we think of as the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And if you understand that history, it helps to understand the conflicts and tension and war across that whole region. Sorry, Abbas, did you hear that? He was asking about the Durand Line between Pakistan and Afghanistan and how it's contributed to the ongoing conflicts in that country. Is that something you can shed some light on?
Not that particular issue, but I do know that, colonial era borders drawn on maps a century ago continued to influence the politics of today. I know one of the main reasons why the Taliban are so fervent and so committed in their takeover of Afghanistan is because they feel like that is their ancestral homeland and because they get incredible support from across the border. So, look, anyone who has tried to predict the future of Afghanistan has failed and failed miserably. And I'm not going to, repeat that era. What I do hope for is that when the dust settles from this conflict, the, close to 40 million odd Afghans who call Afghanistan home, I just hope that they're able to wake up and have enough food to put on the table, and even that minimum is now at risk. So I'm sorry to veer off the question, but the layers of Afghan society, borders being one of them, are so incredibly dense and so incredibly, multi-layered that no wonder that after 20 years of blood and treasure spent in that country, it all collapsed so spectacularly.
Mm. Any other questions?
It looks like I'll get another question then, Abbas. I'm particularly interested in, from the perspective of the media, the entire 20 years of the refugee story in Ballarat is covered here in one newspaper. When you arrived on the Tampa at Christmas Island, there were no photographs. There was the government had prevented any journalists from getting down to the port, although there were many, many journalists on Christmas Island wanting to cover this. Can you say something about the importance of the role of the media in bringing and helping us to understand the situation of people seeking asylum?
No, I heard that one loud and clear. The role of the media in telling the refugee story or in any other story is so incredibly important. I'll give you a couple of personal examples. I was in Washington, D.C. from August of 2019 to August of this year. Those 2 years I saw everything: the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter riots, the election stuff, everything. And so being on the ground and seeing what I did right there in the heart of the Capitol versus reading some of the coverage, both by domestic US press and by the foreign press, it was either incredibly on point or just wildly off. And I wondered, for the rest of the world who are watching all this play out, how much of their information was accurate and how much of that was incredibly biased. So the media have an incredible and thankless job at times. Telling the refugee story, look, like I said before, we were faceless and nameless foreigners. And now the reason I took up this offer to write this book was to finally tell our story from our perspective. I think, and again, this might be a bit ignorant of me, given I'm not very aware of the Australian media landscape, but I think when it comes to really topical issues such as refugees and migration, that you have a much more divided media discourse over there relative to what we have in New Zealand. I like to think that we can have a much more civilized discussion about some of those hot button topics, whereas some of the tabloid press, especially in the Australian media, really go 100 on a particular sore point. And so that is incredibly challenging, and I can't speak for how to fix that. What I can say is that when it comes to these articles, if possible, if you can open up space for someone who perhaps has gone through it to be able to relay and retell the story, then that kind of makes it a bit more human. And that's why it's so important to have a bit more diversity in the newsroom. And I'm not saying diversity of skin color or gender, I'm saying diversity of experience and background. I mean, you could have someone who's gone through a refugee background covering a refugee story. I think they'd be able to tell it far better than someone who's perhaps seen it from afar.
That's great advice to the editor of a newspaper, and Abbas, I take it because it goes back to the fundamental rule of showing, not telling, and there is a danger always, regardless of the media, to preach, and there is political positioning, and there is, of course, the other compelling element in the media today, and that is just income and survival. And it's driven You mentioned the tabloid media. The tabloid media is largely driven by what it can sell. And there is a juxtaposition between the duty you have as a newspaper compared to the money you have to keep making to survive. But I will say this, that at a community level in Australia, and the company that I work for that owns the Courier is called Australian Community Media, and all the editors who I speak to on a daily basis do have a genuine commitment to tell stories, as distinct from just chase clicks, or, and one of the more dangerous and extreme elements of tabloid is to just incite fear and to provide simple, black and white solutions to complex problems. But in conclusion, and I know nobody came here to listen to me, they came to listen to you, but your advice is so sound that I think it's important. And I will say this, Abbas, that I think the most important element that has been missing from the whole discourse on refugees, both in Australia and perhaps in many other places, has been that human element. And you mentioned the lack of photographs on the Tampa, and Jerry spoke about the reduction of everybody on Nauru to a number and the dehumanising impact that has. What I would like to say, and I'm sure everyone would like to join me, is congratulating you on your book, because it adds to the very valuable literature that tells a human story.
Thank you, and it means so much to see the reception that it's received. And look, if COVID weren't a thing, I'll be in Australia hopefully next year, March, April and May. I'll be going around all the major centres, and I'd love to stop by and see that the second biggest gold nugget in the world apparently is right there in Ballarat.
Yeah, there is a little bit more to the gold and the cold, but yes, we will welcome you here, Abbas. Thank you again.
No worries, all the best. Thank you very much.